Baby heard a German shepherd crying in the rain. What she did next is unforgettable. There are moments in life that shake you. This is one of them. A child with nothing but courage, a dog with nothing but pain, and a connection that proved healing sometimes comes from the unlikeliest places. This story changed lives. It might just change yours too. The rain came down in silver sheets that night, tapping softly against the windows like the fingertips of something too gentle to be seen. In the stillness of her room, lit only by the faint glow of a cloud-covered moon, 2.5-year-old Clara stirred. She didn't wake like children usually do, from dreams or nightmares, thirst or a mother's touch. She woke because something outside was crying. Not shouting, not barking, crying. A long, broken sound, wet, wounded, filled with a kind of sorrow that didn't belong to the wind. It pulled her from her dreams and brought her, barefoot, to the edge of the world she knew, the window. Her tiny fingers curled against the cold pane as she looked out into the yard, where the trees danced in shadows and the rain fell without mercy. Somewhere out there, hidden just beyond the circle of the porch light, something was weeping into the storm. It wasn't a baby, but it felt like one. The sound rose again, low, trembling, like a soul remembering pain. And though Clara couldn't yet speak in full sentences, couldn't name the thing she felt twisting in her chest, she understood it. Deeply. Instinctively. It was a dog. Alone. Hurting. Calling. The grown-ups would have called it imagination. A trick of wind. A stray's echo bouncing between fences. But Clara knew better. She pressed her palm to the glass, eyes wide and unblinking. She didn't cry. She didn't move. She simply listened, as if her stillness was the only answer the sound needed. And then, without fear, without thought, she turned away from the window, padded softly across the creaky wooden floor, and made her way to the back door. No one else heard it, but she did. And what she did next would unravel secrets buried in silence, mend what others thought unfixable, and change everything the grown-ups believed about loyalty, memory, and the quiet ways love returns when we least expect it. The first night it happened, the house seemed to hold its breath. Thunder grumbled across the sky like a restless old man clearing his throat, but inside Clara's nursery, everything was still. The soft whir of a nightlight hummed in one corner, its glow barely touching the lace curtains that billowed faintly in the draft. 2.5 years old, Clara stirred without sound. She didn't call out. She didn't cry. She simply sat up, her small hands gripping the rail of her crib as she turned her head toward the window. The rain tapped steadily, a quiet rhythm, familiar and sleepy. But then came the other sound, the one that didn't belong. Faint, wet, trembling, like someone was trying not to be heard and yet begging not to be ignored. Clara tilted her head, listening the way only the very young and the very old know how to, with their hearts instead of their ears. Something outside was in pain. She climbed onto her knees, eyes fixed on the blur of the world beyond the glass. The rain distorted everything. Trees bent in strange shapes, garden lights flickered like distant stars, and somewhere in that shifting darkness came the cry again. It wasn't sharp like a cat's mew or chaotic like a scream. It was low, wounded, as if the night itself were bleeding. Elena found her like that, wide awake, pressed to the window, lips parted but silent. "Sweetheart, what are you doing?" she whispered, lifting the child gently. Clara didn't answer. She just pointed, a small finger against the cold pane, toward a patch of shadow beyond the yard. Elena followed the gesture but saw nothing, just rain and wind and fence. A child's fancy, she thought. Just a dream that got stuck in her daughter's eyes. She kissed her forehead, carried her back to bed, and hummed her lullaby. Clara didn't resist, but even as her eyes closed, her hand remained outstretched, reaching toward the glass, toward the night. The next morning came heavy with gray skies and the scent of wet earth. Birds remained quiet. The puddles outside reflected branches like black veins. Elena forgot about the window moment, brushing it off as sleep confusion, until she returned from the kitchen and found Clara again, standing on tiptoe at the window, her forehead resting on the glass. This time, the child's hand was pointing not just toward the yard but to the space beneath the old maple tree, where the ground dipped slightly and water tended to pool after rain. Elena looked harder. Still nothing. That night, Clara refused her bedtime story for the first time. She curled up, blanket tucked beneath her chin, but her eyes didn't close. When the first roll of thunder passed overhead, she was already sitting up. Elena, exhausted from work and dinner and cleaning, didn't argue. She let Clara sit at the window for a while, thought maybe it was a phase, some odd toddler ritual forming in the storm. Then came the whimper. Elena heard it faintly as she passed the hallway, a sound like something caught between a cough and a cry. She paused, listened. Nothing. Just the wind and her own tired thoughts. But Clara was standing now, hand pressed to the doorframe, bare feet planted on the cold wooden floor. "Elena?" her husband called from the bedroom. "You coming?" "In a minute," she replied, watching Clara. Clara reached for the doorknob with slow, careful fingers. She didn't look back. Her face held no fear, no hesitation, only purpose. As if opening that door was as natural as drawing breath. As if she were answering a call no one else could hear. Elena stepped forward quickly, scooping her up just before her fingers could twist the lock. "Not tonight, baby. It's cold out. You'll get sick," she murmured, pressing her close. Clara didn't fight. She just leaned into her mother's chest and whispered something too soft to understand. Elena felt it more than heard it. A sigh, maybe a word. Something like hurt or help. She stood there for a long moment, rocking gently, her eyes drawn toward the black window pane. A part of her wanted to open the door, just to check, just to make sure there was nothing out there. But instead, she turned off the light, drew the curtains tight, and told herself again that it was just the rain. Just the rain. But Clara knew better. And in the silence that followed, she clung a little tighter to the girl who didn't yet have the words, but had already begun to change everything. The first time Elena saw him, he was barely more than a shadow. A soaked, limping silhouette between the trees. Tall, silent, unmoving. A German shepherd, large but thin, drenched in the cold evening rain. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He didn't even step forward. He just stood there, watching. Like he was remembering something he didn't know how to forget. And then, as soon as her eyes met his, he was gone. She almost didn't believe it had happened. Maybe she was just tired. Maybe it was a stray. But the next morning, Clara was standing at the window again, her little finger pressed to the glass. Not crying. Not speaking. Just watching. As if she was waiting for something. And beneath that window, in the soft, wet dirt, a paw print. Just one. That's when Elena started leaving food outside. A little bowl. Some can meet. Not too close to the porch. Just enough to say, if you're out there, this is safe. That night, nothing happened. But in the morning, the food was gone. So was the bowl. And in its place, another print. Just one again. As if whoever had taken it didn't want to scare them. Or didn't want to be seen. Over the next few days, Elena kept trying. Sometimes she'd change the food. Sometimes she'd wait quietly near the window to catch a glimpse. But he never came when she was watching. Only Clara seemed to sense him. She'd pause mid-doodle, her crayon frozen in her hand, and look toward the glass. Not scared. Not even surprised. Like she expected him. Then one morning, something strange appeared on the porch. A tiny sock, Clara's, wet and folded neatly, sitting right by the stairs. Elena, her husband asked over breakfast, "Why is she leaving her clothes outside?" But Elena hadn't given Clara that sock. And Clara, barely awake, just smiled, like she knew the answer already. That's when the pattern began. Clara started leaving little things. A piece of bread, half a banana, a corner of her sandwich. Once, even her favorite stuffed animal, just left quietly near the steps. No one told her to do it. No one taught her. She just threw. And every morning, those items would disappear. Elena didn't know whether to stop it or let it continue. She felt torn. A mother's instinct told her to be cautious, to protect. But another part of her, a deeper, older part, remembered something she had long buried. When she was Clara's age, a neighbor's big black dog had come charging down a sidewalk one afternoon. It didn't bite her, didn't touch her, but she'd never forgotten the sound of its paws on the pavement or how big it looked when it leapt toward her. That fear had lived in her ever since, quiet, dormant, until now. And yet, she didn't stop Clara. One night, Elena looked through the window and finally saw him again. The dog. The same German shepherd. Limping. Hesitant. But this time, he stepped forward. Not onto the porch, but close enough to sniff the edge of Clara's little offering. A chunk of peach wrapped in tissue. He looked up. Not at Elena. Not even at the door. But at Clara's bedroom window. And in that moment, he didn't look like a stray. He looked like he remembered her. Clara didn't wave. She didn't call. She just stood at the window with her tiny hands against the glass, her breath fogging the pane, eyes wide and steady. And then something happened Elena couldn't explain. The dog nodded. Just a slight tilt of his head, like a gesture. A greeting. A thank you. That week, Clara came down with a mild fever. Nothing serious, but it left her tired and quiet. On the third night, Elena carried her into the living room so she could sleep closer to the warmth of the fireplace. Clara's eyes opened just once, soft and dreamy. She looked toward the back window, even in her daze, and then she whispered something. One word. Rain. Elena stopped in her tracks. "What did you say, baby?" Clara didn't answer. She was already drifting off again. But she'd said it clearly, rain. And in that moment, Elena knew this wasn't pretend. Clara knew. She understood something. About the storm. About the sound. About the dog. And suddenly, all those questions, all those doubts, melted into silence. Because when your child hears something no one else does, you learn to listen too. And so, as the rain returned to the windows that night, Elena sat beside her daughter, held her hand, and waited. For the soft sound. For the shadow in the trees. For the next moment the dog would return, not to be fed, but to be understood. He came back. Not once. Not twice. But every night. Always after the sun dipped below the trees and the last light faded from the yard. The German shepherd would appear, just beyond the porch, just outside the glow of the house. He never barked, never paced, never begged for food or shelter. He just stood there, watching. And Clara watched him back. It became their silent ritual. No one spoke. No one moved. The only sound was the gentle clicking of rain against the windows or the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. And though the dog never crossed the invisible line between the wild and the home, it felt, to Clara, like he was already inside. Elena tried to see him, too. She started staying up later, checking the windows every few minutes. But the dog never came when she looked. He came only when Clara was alone. And always from the woods. That's when the neighbors started whispering. One morning, as Elena was watering the front hedge, Mrs. Willoughby from across the street stopped her. "You've got something haunting your trees," she said with a smirk. "Looks just like that police dog they lost over in Ironfield." Elena froze. "Police dog? K9 unit," the woman nodded. Big search a few months ago. Went missing during some kind of raid. Poor thing was presumed dead. But if you ask me, she leaned in, dogs remember where they felt safe. That night, Elena couldn't sleep. She opened her laptop and started searching. Not just local news, but lost pet forums, emergency service pages, even deep into the weird corners of Facebook. Threads filled with grainy photos, desperate comments, hashtags like #BringHeroHome and #IronfieldK9. She found a name, Bruno, a retired German Shepherd who had been called back into active duty for a high-risk operation. The official story was that he ran off after a flashbang. Never returned. Presumed dead, but not buried. Meanwhile, Clara's behavior had shifted again. She started drawing more. Not just scribbles or stick figures, but real shapes. A dog, always the same one. Same eyes. Same proud stance. Always with someone next to him. A tall figure, covered in shadow. Elena watched her one afternoon as Clara slowly filled the page. "Who's that with the dog, sweetheart?" she asked gently. Clara didn't answer. She just picked up a black crayon and darkened the figure's face. One long stroke, then another, until it disappeared entirely. Elena felt a chill she couldn't explain. And then came the night Clara slipped outside. It was quiet, past midnight. Elena had dozed off on the couch, a book still open on her lap. The rain had stopped hours ago, but the world still felt wet, like the air itself hadn't dried yet. She woke with a start, suddenly aware of the silence. And the open back door. Her heart dropped. She called Clara's name once, twice. No answer. She rushed into the yard, barefoot, flashlight trembling in her hand. The beam bounced off the trees, scanning, searching, and then froze. Clara was standing at the edge of the yard, just before the woods. Not crying, not scared, just still. And the dog was there too, but he wasn't looking at Clara. He was staring at the old oak tree, the one with twisted roots and hollow scars in its bark. His ears were up, his body rigid, but his eyes, they were soft. Remembering. Elena didn't move. Neither did the dog. Clara turned slowly, her face calm, almost solemn. She pointed toward the tree and whispered something too quiet to hear. The dog didn't flinch. He just sat down in the wet leaves, eyes fixed on the oak like it was speaking to him in a language only he understood. Elena stepped forward, scooped Clara into her arms. The little girl rested her head on her mother's shoulder and whispered, "He's not lost." And in that moment, Elena knew this wasn't just about a stray dog anymore. Something deeper was waiting in those woods. Something neither of them had remembered, until now. The next morning, the sky still hadn't cleared. The rain had stopped, but the world remained heavy, soaked through, like the earth itself was grieving. Elena stood by the kitchen sink, staring through the window at the old oak tree. Something about the way the branches curled, reaching like broken fingers toward the sky, pulled at her. It wasn't logic. It wasn't curiosity. It was something else. A feeling she couldn't name. A whisper from the back of her mind. Like the past was calling her forward. Without a word, she put on her boots, left her phone on the counter, and walked into the yard. Clara watched her go from the living room window. She didn't speak. She didn't follow. She just placed her palm on the glass. Elena approached the base of the tree slowly, each step squishing through the mud. The smell of wet leaves and something older, deeper, filled her nose. She bent down, brushing away a patch of soft dirt with her fingertips, not expecting anything. But something was there. A glint. Metal. She leaned closer, heart pounding, and uncovered a small rusted tag, a dog tag. Part of the name had corroded away, but the shape was unmistakable. Elena's breath caught. She dug deeper, fingers trembling. Just beneath the tag was a torn collar, leather cracked and half-rotted from the years. And beneath that, something worse. White fragments. Tiny, fragile, curved like ribs. Some broken, some smooth. Both. Elena jerked her hand back, gasping. She sat back on her heels, mud streaking her jeans, chest rising and falling like she'd run a mile. The shepherd was there. She hadn't heard him approach. He stood just a few feet away, motionless, his eyes locked on hers. He didn't growl. He didn't step forward. And for some reason, that was worse. Because it wasn't menace in his stare. It was memory. It was mourning. Elena stumbled to her feet and ran back into the house. Her hands were shaking as she grabbed the phone and dialed animal control. Her voice came out too fast, too loud. "Yes, I found something in my yard. Near an oak tree. A collar. Both. Please, someone needs to." The words were still tumbling out when Clara appeared. She didn't scream. She didn't speak. She just ran across the room and slapped the phone out of her mother's hand. It crashed to the floor, battery skittering under the couch. And then Clara cried. Not loudly. Not with noise. With her whole body. She dropped to her knees, fists balled at her sides, face twisted in a silent sob, the kind that doesn't make sound because it goes too deep for sound. It was the first time Elena had ever seen her daughter cry like that. Not since the accident. Not since the night she stopped speaking. Elena dropped to the floor beside her, pulling her into her arms. "Baby, it's okay. You're safe. It's okay." But Clara shook her head, pressing her face into Elena's shoulder, sobbing without sound. That night, Elena sat on the couch long after Clara had fallen asleep, wrapped in a blanket, the tag from the trees still in her pocket. She didn't call animal control again. She didn't dig up anything more. Instead, she remembered. A storm. Years ago. She had been 12. A flood had swept through their neighborhood. Violent. She remembered the fear. The shouting. Her father carrying her through the rising water. And the dog, their dog, who had disappeared in the chaos. He had been just like this one. Or gentle. Protective. She had cried for weeks. No one ever found him. And now, sitting in her quiet living room, listening to the wind in the trees and the hush of Clara's breathing down the hall, Elena wondered something she hadn't dared to before. What if the past wasn't gone? What if it was just waiting? Watching? Waiting for someone to remember. Something changed that morning. It wasn't loud or sudden. It was quiet, like the way grief fades, not with answers, but with understanding. For the first time, the German shepherd stepped out of the trees and didn't stop. He didn't stay hidden. He crept forward, limping slightly, and lay down at the edge of the porch, close enough to be seen, but far enough not to ask for anything. He didn't bark. He didn't beg. He just lay there, head on his paws, soaked fur clinging to his body, as if he had finally given in to the weight he'd been carrying for far too long. Clara saw him and didn't hesitate. She went back inside and came out a moment later carrying her favorite blanket, the one with faded moons and soft edges from too many washes. She walked right up to him, slowly, gently, and laid the blanket across his back. The shepherd didn't flinch. He didn't move. He just closed his eyes and let it happen. As if something inside him, something deeper than instinct, understood that this child, this tiny girl, was the only person who hadn't asked him for anything, and the only one who had given him something real. Elena stood at the door, frozen. From that close, she could finally see him in the daylight. The scars on his legs, the healed-over wound on his side. But what caught her breath were the marks around his neck. Deep, dark grooves, like he'd worn a collar too tight, for too long. Not a pet's collar. Not a tag with a name. This was something else. She crouched down slowly, watching him. The way his eyes stayed low. The way he didn't look at her, but didn't fear her either. He wasn't wild. He wasn't broken. He was tired. Later that day, while Clara sat nearby drawing quietly on the porch, Mr. Grayson from next door came walking over. He'd seen the dog too, and something in his face said he knew more than he let on. "That dog," he said, "he used to be a cop." Elena blinked. "He 9. Mr. Grayson nodded. "Ironfield PD. Part of a special unit. They trained him to take down the worst of the worst. He was good. Too good, maybe. Until one night, during a raid, something went wrong." He looked at the shepherd again and his voice lowered. "They said he hesitated. Let a suspect go. A man got hurt. And they blamed the dog. Said he failed. Said he ran. But you know what I think?" Elena didn't answer. "I think he didn't fail," Mr. Grayson whispered. "I think he chose not to hurt someone. Maybe a child. Maybe someone who didn't deserve it. And instead of thanking him, they left him." The words landed like stones in Elena's chest. She looked back at Clara, who was now sitting beside the dog, gently sketching him into the corner of a paper. Not the way children draw animals, but the way someone draws someone they've met in a dream. Clara looked up quietly and said something barely above a breath. "He remembers." And somehow, Elena knew exactly what she meant. This wasn't just a dog who'd been trained and abandoned. This was a soul who had been told to be loyal, to be brave, and when he followed his heart instead of his orders, he was punished for it. But Clara didn't believe the story they told about him. And now, watching him lie under her child's blanket with the weight of silence in his eyes, neither did Elena. Something changed in the house, but no one spoke about it, they only felt it. The German shepherd no longer stayed curled in the wet grass or hidden behind trees. He moved closer now, choosing the porch at first, and then one night, quietly settling in front of Clara's bedroom door. He didn't ask permission. He didn't make a sound. He just lay down, long body stretched across the hallway floor, as if he had always belonged there, as if he had taken it upon himself to guard something more precious than sleep. Elena noticed the change most in Clara. The little girl who used to wake with wide, frightened eyes now slept through the night. Her breath was even. Her body no longer tensed in her blankets. Something in her had shifted, the way a string slowly untangles after holding tight for too long. Elena couldn't explain it, but she could feel it. The way the house exhaled a little softer, the way silence no longer felt lonely. Still, curiosity tugged at her. One night, after Clara was tucked in and the shepherd had taken his place on the hallway rug, Elena quietly set up the old baby monitor just outside her daughter's door. She wasn't expecting much, maybe the sound of shifting paws or soft breathing. But around midnight, as the wind pushed gently against the windows, she heard something that made her breath catch. It wasn't a bark. It wasn't a growl. It was Clara's voice, quiet, dreamlike, not awake, but not quite dreaming either. "Don't go back in the water," she whispered, as if the words had come from someplace far older than her short years. The monitor crackled slightly, and then silence returned. Elena sat frozen, the device trembling in her hand. The words weren't frantic. They didn't sound like a nightmare. They sounded like a memory, one that didn't belong to her daughter at all. In the morning, Clara was her usual quiet self, smiling faintly, moving slowly as if nothing had happened. But when Elena entered her room to open the windows and straighten the blankets, she noticed something that made her stop cold. There, on the wooden floor beside the crib, were paw prints. Muddy. Unmistakable. They formed a circle, as if someone had paced around the crib through the night, watching, protecting. But the floor was dry. The windows had stayed locked. No doors had been opened. The mud hadn't come from outside. And yet, the prints were still fresh. Elena knelt slowly, reaching out to touch one. It was real. They pressed gently into the grain of the floor. Not rushed, not chaotic. Just there, a quiet reminder that someone had kept watch. That night, Elena didn't bother with the monitor. She wrapped herself in a blanket and sat quietly in the hallway, just a few feet from the shepherd. He didn't turn to look at her. He didn't need to. He simply lay still, eyes half open, gaze fixed on the door to Clara's room. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was full, like the kind of silence shared between two people who both know something is real, but neither wants to say it aloud. As the hours passed, Elena realized something she hadn't allowed herself to believe. The dog wasn't just protecting Clara from the outside world. He was holding something back, something that didn't have a face or a name, something that lived deeper than shadow. Something that had been waiting. But now it couldn't reach her, because someone else stood between it and the child. Someone who had been forgotten, discarded, and blamed, but who still knew how to protect what mattered most. It was one of those mornings where the sky hung low and heavy, as if the world itself was waiting to remember something it had long tried to forget. The air was cool, not from wind, but from something older, a stillness that made the leaves pause in their rustling. Elena had barely finished her first sip of tea when Clara, still in her slippers, walked quietly to her side, took her hand, and looked up without a word. There was no urgency in her face, just quiet certainty. Elena followed. They walked through the damp grass, past the garden, past the trees that had grown too wild over the years, until the edge of the property gave way to the creek. It was a place Elena hadn't visited in years, not since before Clara was born. There, almost invisible beneath a blanket of ivy and the kind of decay that comes only with time and silence, stood an old wooden shed. It leaned slightly to the left, as if it had grown tired of standing tall. Its paint had long since peeled away, leaving behind streaks of gray and green, like it was trying to become part of the woods. Clara said nothing, only looked up once at her mother, and then reached for the rusted latch. It groaned in protest as it opened, revealing a breath of air that smelled like mold, rust, and forgotten years. Elena stepped inside first. The light from the open door poured in behind her, catching the shapes of shattered tools on the floor, splintered handles, rusted heads. Against the far wall, something gleamed faintly in the shadows. Chains. Thick ones. Broken and old, but still bearing the memory of whatever they had once held. A metal box lay toppled near the back corner. Inside it, barely intact, was a weather-beaten folder with torn pages spilling out. Elena picked it up slowly, her fingers brushing across fragments of official police files. Names, numbers, blurred-out faces. But one page caught her breath. In handwriting that was rushed, shaky, and desperate, someone had scrawled across the top of a torn sheet, "He saved me." They buried the truth and him. The paper trembled in her hands, but not from wind. It felt like the shed itself was alive, like the walls were holding their breath, waiting to be heard. She looked around, suddenly aware that this wasn't just a forgotten place. It was a grave, not of bones, but of secrets. Behind her, Clara stepped inside the threshold and froze. Not from fear, from something deeper. Her eyes weren't on the chains, or the broken tools, or the papers. They were on the doorway. Elena turned just in time to see the German shepherd standing there, rigid and alert, his body low, teeth bared in a soundless growl. But he wasn't looking at Clara. He wasn't even looking at Elena. His gaze was locked on the woods just beyond the shed, where the trees stood a little too still, and the shadows were just a little too dark. Elena stepped forward instinctively, placing one hand on Clara's shoulder. "It's okay," she whispered, though she didn't know if it was true. The dog didn't move. His tail didn't wag. His ears didn't twitch. He remained locked in that silent snarl, his breath slow and heavy, not from aggression, but from memory, from recognition, like something out there had once crossed a line and hadn't yet been forgiven. Clara took one slow step toward the open door and whispered something Elena didn't quite catch. It wasn't meant for her. It was meant for him. Whatever had happened in that shed, whatever pain had once been chained and silenced, hadn't ended. It had only been waiting. But now it was no longer hidden. And it wasn't welcome anymore. It started with a shadow. Not a loud presence, not someone who knocked or shouted. Just a figure that lingered a little too long near corners, walked a little too slowly past the same houses, appeared on streets where no one had called for help. He wore a battered brown hat, slouched low over his eyes, and walked with a limp, the kind that wasn't born from injury, but from years of walking away from things he didn't want to face. Elena first noticed him on a Wednesday morning, standing near the old mailboxes at the end of the street. He wasn't delivering anything, just staring, hands in his coat pockets. When she looked back a moment later, he was gone. But that evening, the dog's behavior changed. He was no longer calm. The moment the man appeared again, near the bus stop this time, the German shepherd shot upright, teeth bared, growling low and steady. It wasn't just a warning. It was recognition. His fur bristled. His body tensed. He positioned himself between Clara and the front gate, refusing to move until the man had vanished down the road. Elena had never seen him like that. He'd always been quiet. Protective, yes, but never aggressive. This was different. This was personal. And Clara froze. She pressed herself into Elena's legs, arms wrapped tightly around her mother's thighs, her tiny shoulders trembling. She didn't cry, didn't scream. She just stared at the man with wide, unblinking eyes, as if she knew him, as if he belonged to a part of the story no one had ever told her, but that she somehow already carried in her bones. The man came back again the next day, then again the next week, always walking, always watching, always too close for comfort but just far enough for denial. Elena reported him, called the local police, told them there was someone strange patrolling their neighborhood. They ran his description, looked into her concerns. But they found nothing. No name, no record, no reason to detain. He was just another face to them, old, strange, and legally invisible. But not to Clara, and not to the dog. That night, Clara didn't eat. She sat at the kitchen table silently, crayon in hand, a blank piece of paper in front of her. Elena thought she was just tired, but when she finally walked past the table, she caught a glimpse of what Clara had drawn, the man. The same hat, the same eyes. But this time, his hands were stained with red. Red that dripped down to the ground. Red that looked less like crayon and more like a message. Elena picked up the paper slowly, heart pounding. "Clara," she whispered, "who is this?" Clara didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her eyes stayed fixed on the doorway, where the dog now lay, silent but alert, as if he too had seen the drawing. Or worse, remembered it. That night, Elena couldn't sleep. She sat on the couch, the drawing still in her hand, the baby monitor quiet beside her. And that's when it hit her. The things Clara knew, the images she drew, the names she never learned but somehow understood. They weren't coming from books or television. No one had told her these stories. No one had warned her about the man or his hands or his past. But she knew, because the dog had shown her. Not in words, not in bark or gesture, but in presence, in breath, in the shared silence of the night, where stories passed not through language, but through memory, where broken souls found each other in the dark and remembered. The sky cracked open just past midnight, not with a whisper, but with a roar, the kind that makes trees bow and power lines sway like frightened dancers. Thunder rolled in long, jagged waves across the rooftops, and rain fell so heavily it seemed to blur the world outside into a single gray curtain. Elena woke with a start, the windows rattling around her, her heart already pounding before her mind could catch up. But it wasn't the storm that had stirred her. It was movement, a small shadow drifting across the hallway, barefoot, silent, certain. The little girl moved as if pulled by a string, her steps slow and dreamlike, her hand reaching toward the front door. Elena called out softly, but Clara didn't turn. She was already at the threshold, her fingers brushing the knob, her eyes wide and distant. Not frightened, not lost, just listening. And then came the growl. Urgent. Desperate. The dog was already there, blocking the door with his body, eyes locked on Clara, tail stiff, ears pinned back. He whined once, a pleading sound, then growled again as if to say, "Not this time. Not you." Elena rushed forward, flashlight in hand, her heart a tangle of confusion and dread. Clara looked up at her mother with eyes full of something too old for her years. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The shepherd barked once, sharp, commanding, then turned and bolted down the hallway toward the back of the house. Elena didn't hesitate. She grabbed her coat, scooped Clara into her arms, and followed. The back door flung open with a gust of wind that slapped her breath away. The rain hit like needles, soaking her instantly as the beam of her flashlight flickered through the chaos. The dog was already ahead of them, moving like a streak of shadow through the yard, toward the woods and the creek that now roared like a wounded animal. Water had risen fast, swallowing the banks, pulling at the roots of trees, churning with branches and debris. And there, in the water, was movement. A figure, half submerged, dragging something heavy through the current. Elena froze, the scream caught in her throat. It was him, the man with the hat. His coat was plastered to his back, the brim of his hat lost in the downpour, his body bent and heaving as he pulled a bundle behind him. Something wrapped in canvas and cord, something too long, too heavy to be anything but human. And then he turned. His face lit up in the flashlight's beam, hollow-eyed, wild, not surprised to be seen, only furious. Like a secret caught too late. Elena screamed. The dog lunged. With a growl that shook the trees, the shepherd charged into the water, body slicing through the current like a blade. The man shouted, stumbling, falling backward into the mud as the bundle slipped from his grip. Elena clutched Clara tighter, backing away toward the trees as flashing lights suddenly bloomed on the far hill, red, blue, blinding. Sirens cut through the storm like knives. By the time the police reached the creek, the man was sprawled face down in the mud, the shepherd standing over him, chest heaving, teeth bared, rain streaking through his fur like war paint. Officers pulled him away, cuffed the man, unwrapped the bundle. It wasn't a body, not this time, but evidence. Books, tools, items no child should ever see. But Clara was gone. Elena spun in panic, heart stuttering. Her flashlight beam darted across the trees until it caught something, a flicker of pink. She ran. The shed. Clara was inside, huddled in the corner, cold and soaked but alive, her arms wrapped around her knees, eyes wide and unblinking. The shepherd appeared behind her a moment later, silent as always, and lay at her side, pressing his warm body against hers like a fire without flame. The man was taken into custody. Later, they would say he had a long record under another name, that he'd been part of that failed raid years ago, not as a suspect, but as something worse. That the police files in the shed had been part of an old cover-up. That someone had known. That someone had buried the truth. But not anymore. Whatever he had tried to bury in the water, in the past, had risen. And this time it had barked back. The house was too quiet without him. Not empty, just waiting. The space where the dog used to lie near Clara's door stayed untouched, as if no one dared to step into the silence he left behind. After the arrest, after the sirens faded and the creek stopped raging, the police had taken him in for evaluation. Standard procedure, they said. He wasn't chipped. No official records remained. He was just listed as a retired asset, presumed lost. They wanted to observe him, test his reactions, assess whether he could be trusted again. But none of that mattered to Clara. For 3 days, she didn't speak. She sat by the window in her small chair, the one with peeling blue paint and worn cushions, her knees tucked beneath her chin. She didn't eat much. She didn't cry. She just watched the road, as if waiting for someone who had promised he'd be back. On the 4th morning, Elena couldn't take the stillness anymore. Clara hadn't smiled, hadn't drawn, hadn't even hummed. The light that had started to return to her face, the quiet joy of safety, of trust, was slipping away again, like it had only borrowed time. So Elena made a decision. She bundled Clara into the car and drove toward the old train station just outside town. The place barely anyone used anymore, the one that had been in a photo Elena found in one of the old news articles, the last known sighting of the shepherd after the raid gone wrong. The building was quiet, its bricks weathered, its benches splintered by time. The clock above the platform no longer ticked, frozen at a time no one remembered. But the stillness wasn't empty. It felt like something had lived here once, not with noise, but with hope. Waiting. The police chief was already there, hands in his coat pockets, his cap pulled low against the wind. He wasn't a man who spoke unnecessarily. But when he saw Clara step onto the platform, her small fingers clutching a folded piece of paper, something in his posture changed, softened. "He waited here," he said quietly, almost to himself, "for weeks. Sat right there on that bench every evening. Rain, snow, didn't matter. Just watched the tracks. We thought he was waiting for the handler. But now," he trailed off. Clara walked to the bench and unfolded her drawing. She didn't look at the chief. She didn't say a word. She simply laid the paper gently on the wood and stepped back. It was a picture of herself and the dog beneath a familiar tree, not the one near the house, but the one by the creek. In the picture, their faces weren't drawn with exactness, but they were unmistakably whole. The chief looked down at the drawing, then at Clara, then at Elena. "We get a lot of dogs through our department," he murmured. "Most of them follow commands. Most of them do what they're trained to do. But this one, he followed something else." They didn't stay long. The wind picked up, and Clara finally reached for her mother's hand, her eyes softer now, her shoulders no longer so tight. They drove home without speaking. That night, the storm didn't come. The sky stayed still, and the world, just for a while, felt settled. And then, just past midnight, a familiar sound echoed down the hallway. A quiet step, a low breath, the softest thump of a heavy body lowering to the floor outside Clara's door. Elena stepped out of her room and stopped at the end of the hall. There he was, wet from the evening dew, his limp still present but lighter now, as if part of his burden had been left on that train platform. The shepherd turned his head, met her eyes, and blinked once. Clara didn't say a word when she saw him the next morning. She just curled up beside him on the hallway rug, wrapped her arms around his neck, and sighed, as if the last piece of the story had finally come home. The story spread in the way quiet things sometimes do, carried not by shouting, but by the hush that follows something extraordinary. First it was the neighbors, then a local teacher, then someone from the town paper. And before long, the headlines began to appear. Local girl finds missing K9. Child leads authorities to evidence in cold case. And the one that stuck most of all, the dog whisperer of Briar Creek. It was a title Clara never asked for and never wanted. Cameras showed up at the edge of the driveway. Reporters called the house. A radio station even left a voicemail asking for an exclusive. But Elena never returned their messages. And Clara? Clara simply looked out the window each time someone knocked, then turned away without a word. She didn't need a spotlight. She wasn't looking to be believed. All she wanted was Bruno. That's what she had named him, one afternoon after he returned, Bruno. The name had come to her in a whisper, the kind you hear in your chest rather than your ears. And once she said it out loud, he responded like he'd been waiting all along. Bruno. No longer just the dog. No longer just a shadow with scars. He became something more, a presence, a protector, a truth no one else had taken the time to understand. He slept peacefully now, stretched across the hallway rug or curled beside the back door. He no longer twitched in his dreams. No longer whimpered in his sleep. As if something inside him had finally been heard. He didn't need to run anymore. Clara began painting again. Elena found her one morning kneeling beside her bedroom wall, brush in hand, eyes full of calm. The painting wasn't just of a dog. It was Bruno, yes. His familiar ears, the slope of his back, the way he always watched without blinking. But there was more. In the picture, he stood in the middle of a great storm, rain pouring around him, his body casting a long shadow across a girl curled on the ground behind him. His eyes glowed faintly, not with menace, but with knowing. It wasn't just a portrait. It was a memory, a thank you, a truth spoken in color instead of words. That night, as Clara lay in bed and the world outside finally settled into summer stillness, Elena sat beside her, brushing back her daughter's curls. "Clara," she asked gently, "how did you know? About him? About all of it?" Clara didn't answer right away. She looked toward the window, where moonlight danced across the glass, where the same rain that once kept her awake now felt like a lullaby she could barely remember. She reached out and placed her small hand against the window pane. It was dry now, no storm, no sound, only memory. Then, in a voice so soft it barely stirred the air, she whispered, "He told me. In the rain." And with that, she closed her eyes. Bruno shifted on the rug outside her door, let out a long, slow sigh, and slept. It happened one final time, not in the middle of a storm or under the glare of sirens, but in the quiet stillness of a safe home, the kind of night where even the air seems to pause, waiting. Bruno stirred just after midnight, his body twitching, breath uneven. A soft whimper rose from his throat, not loud, but broken. It was the sound of a memory surfacing, one too old to name, too deep to forget. He didn't rise, just lay there, caught in something that sleep hadn't soothed. Clara's door opened without a creak. She didn't call out. She didn't ask what was wrong. She simply walked across the hallway, dragging her blanket behind her, and knelt beside him. He didn't startle. He didn't growl. He just looked at her, eyes glassy, heart full, and waited. She draped the blanket over his back and then, without hesitation, lay down beside him on the floor, her small arms curling around his chest, her head rising and falling with the rhythm of his breath. Her voice, when it came, was so soft it could have been part of a dream. "No more cages," she whispered, not as a command, not as comfort, but as a promise. A closing of something that had once been too wide, too painful, too open. Bruno didn't move. His breathing slowed. His eyes closed. And for the first time since he had wandered into their lives, through rain, through memory, through silence, he didn't flinch again. Whatever had haunted his sleep finally let go. Years passed. The seasons changed, as they always do. Time gathered quietly around them, like dust in corners that no longer needed to be swept. Clara grew. The paintings changed, the windows stayed dry, and Bruno's face turned silver before it turned still. But he was never forgotten. Not by Clara. Not by the trees that once whispered his name. not by the creek that still carried pieces of stories beneath its surface. Clara was 11 when she returned to the water alone. The shed was still there, older now, softer around the edges, the ivy thicker than before. She sat by the water's edge, the sun warm on her shoulders, her legs crossed beneath her. The creek moved slower now, as if it too had grown tired of carrying secrets. Clara leaned forward and let her fingers trace the old wooden door, now splintered and softened by time. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. Her fingers knew the grooves like an old lullaby. And then she smiled. It wasn't the smile of a child. It was the smile of someone who remembered something no one else believed. Someone who knew that truth didn't always live in headlines or reports or the neat ending of a story. It lived in the space between silence and sound. "He wasn't just crying in the rain," she said softly, her eyes reflecting the shimmer of the water. "He was waiting for me to hear him." The trees rustled gently behind her, and the wind, for just a moment, carried the memory of a low, steady breath and a promise that had been kept. Sometimes, the most profound connections are the ones we can't explain. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments. Like, share, and subscribe to continue exploring the mysteries of life. Until then, remember, there's magic in the unknown.